My stepdad told me to never touch anything in his house without permission. He didn't think that one through. My stepdad, Greg, had been blaming me for everything since he moved in 6 months ago, like the scratch on his car that was already there, or the coffee maker that broke because it was 12 years old. He'd measure the distance between furniture and the wall with an actual ruler and accuse me of moving things when they were off by half an inch. One Saturday, he grounded me because a picture frame was supposedly crooked, even though I hadn't been in that room for days. "You're always touching things that don't belong to you," he said, while my mom stood there looking exhausted. "How about this? Never touch anything in this house without my permission." My mom tried to say that was unreasonable, but Greg cut her off, saying he was tired of me disrespecting his belongings, and this would teach me boundaries. "Not a single thing without asking first," he repeated, looking proud of his new rule. I said okay, and went to my room, already planning exactly how this would play out. The next morning, Greg started banging on my door because I hadn't taken out the trash like I did every week. "I can't touch the trash bags without your permission," I called through the door. He stood there giving me permission for the garbage bags, then realizing I'd also need permission for the doorknob, the garage door, the trash cans, and the driveway gate. The garbage truck passed while he was still listing things, and the smell of rotting trash would linger for another week, making his precious house stink. Later, I accidentally grabbed a glass of water without thinking, and Greg absolutely exploded, screaming about how I couldn't follow one simple rule and grounding me for another week. "If you're going to be this strict about it, I need written permission so I don't mess up again," I said, and he actually wrote, "Can touch water glasses," on a piece of paper. From then on, I asked for written permission for everything, and he had to provide it, or look like the psycho he was. The house started falling apart fast because I couldn't do any chores without touching things. When his sister visited and saw dishes piled up and the bathroom disgusting, she asked Greg why he wasn't keeping his house clean. He tried to explain about teaching me a lesson, but she looked at him like he'd lost his mind and told my mom she was worried about her living with someone so controlling. His reputation in the family started crumbling as word spread that he wouldn't let a kid touch dishes. I stopped doing homework because all the school supplies in the house belonged to Greg, and when my grades tanked, the school called him in for a parent conference. The principal said she was deeply concerned about Greg's parenting methods and mentioned that preventing a child from doing homework could be considered educational neglect. Greg tried to explain his household rule, but sounded completely unhinged, and the principal started documenting everything for a potential child services report. My mom tried to intervene, but Greg insisted I was manipulating the situation. Meanwhile, his house was becoming unlivable because I'd stopped turning off lights, stopped closing the refrigerator, and was eating meals standing over the sink. His electric bill tripled, all his organic food rotted, and when his boss came for dinner and found me eating spaghetti with my hands directly from the pot, Greg's professional reputation took a massive hit. His boss left early and started treating Greg differently at work, like he was unstable. Greg's notebook of permissions grew thicker every day as he had to account for doorknobs, chairs, the TV remote, my toothbrush, and hundreds of other things. My mom found him up at 2 in the morning frantically writing permissions for the next day and told him he looked insane. She started sleeping in the guest room and told her friends that Greg had become impossible to live with, and soon everyone knew he was the guy who made his stepkid get written permission to use the toilet. Then the school called threatening legal action because I'd missed a week of assignments, and they considered Greg's rules a form of abuse. His company's HR department got an anonymous tip about his home situation, probably from his boss, and suddenly Greg was being investigated at work too. The neighbors had noticed me standing in the yard because I couldn't touch the door to go back inside without permission, and they'd started their own documentation of Greg's bizarre behavior. Greg was screaming at me about ruining his life while my mom packed her bags, saying she couldn't watch this anymore. I stood there silently because I hadn't asked permission to touch the kitchen chair to sit down, watching the washing machine in the corner that had been running for 2 days straight because I'd started it before the rule and couldn't touch it again to stop it. The machine was shaking violently from the unbalanced load, water pooling everywhere, and I could see it lurching forward with each spin cycle. Greg was standing right in front of it, still yelling about how I'd turned everyone against him, when the machine made a horrible grinding sound and started sliding across the floor. My mom grabbed my arm and pulled me back, but Greg was too busy ranting to notice the washer breaking free from the wall completely. I watched it tear loose from the water lines with a metallic shriek, water spraying everywhere, the heavy machine sliding straight toward Greg, who still hadn't turned around. The metal corner of the washer slammed into the back of Greg's left knee and hip with a wet thud, his legs buckling instantly as he crashed sideways into the kitchen cabinets. His shoulder hit the cabinet door first, splintering the cheap wood, Then his head bounced off the counter edge on the way down. Water kept spraying from the torn hoses, soaking everything, making the floor slick as the washer kept sliding forward on its own momentum. The machine's weight pressed against Greg's legs where he'd fallen, pinning him between the washer and the cabinets, while he made this awful groaning sound. Mom was screaming at me to help him, to grab the washer, to do something, but I stayed exactly where I was standing. I couldn't touch the washer without his permission, couldn't move the kitchen chairs to get closer, couldn't even grab towels from the drawer to stop the water spreading across the floor. Mom looked at me with this expression that went from panic to horror to understanding in about 2 seconds when I said I needed Greg's permission to touch anything to help. She tried pulling the washer herself, but it was too heavy, especially with water making everything slippery, and Greg was yelling in pain every time she moved it even slightly. I pulled out my phone from my pocket, the one thing that was actually mine and not Greg's property, and dialed 911 while Mom kept trying to lift the washer. The dispatcher asked what the emergency was, and I explained about the washing machine accident, then had to explain why I couldn't help move it off my stepdad because of his household rule about not touching anything without permission. She went quiet for a second, probably writing notes about our crazy house, then said units were on the way. Mom was still trying to get Greg to give me permission to help, but he was groaning too loud to form actual words, just making these pain sounds while water pooled around him. The EMTs showed up in about 8 minutes, though it felt way longer with Greg trapped and Mom crying and water spreading everywhere. 2 guys rushed in first, saw the mess, and immediately went for the water valve under the sink while their partner brought in equipment. They had to slide Greg out from under the washer carefully, checking his hip and leg while he tried to tell them not to touch his belongings without asking first. Even with his leg twisted wrong and his face white from pain, Greg was still trying to control who touched what in his house, croaking out permissions for them to use his towels and move his furniture. One EMT looked at me standing there not helping and asked if I was hurt, and I explained about the permission rule while they loaded Greg onto a stretcher. The guy just shook his head and muttered something to his partner about documenting everything. Our neighbor Rosa must have heard the sirens because she was standing in our driveway with her phone out, recording the water flooding out our front door and the ambulance lights flashing. She got video of them wheeling Greg out on the stretcher, him still trying to give orders about his house, while the EMTs ignored him and loaded him up. Mom climbed into the ambulance with Greg, telling me to clean up what I could, then caught herself and said to only touch what I had written permission for. The ambulance pulled away, and I went back inside to the destroyed kitchen, water still everywhere, broken cabinet doors hanging open. I found the one kitchen chair I had written permission to sit on and pulled it to a dry spot, then just sat there looking at the mess. Part of me felt guilty about not helping when the washer hit him, about following his stupid rule even during an emergency. But then I remembered 6 months of being blamed for everything, grounded for nothing, treated like a criminal in my own home, and the guilt got quieter. I wasn't sure which feeling was winning, sitting there in that ruined kitchen. My phone buzzed with texts from Mom at the hospital saying Greg had a sprained hip and fractured ankle, would need surgery, might be there for days. Then more texts started coming through from Greg himself, calling me a manipulative brat, saying I'd planned this whole thing, that I'd destroyed his life on purpose. I screenshot every message and saved them in a folder with all the other evidence I'd been collecting for months, the permission notes, the photos of his rule book, everything. About an hour later, a police officer knocked on the door to take an incident report about the accident. I showed him the binder of written permissions Greg had been keeping, explained how the washing machine had been running for 2 days because I couldn't touch it to turn it off without permission. He kept shaking his head while taking notes, asking me to repeat certain parts, especially about not being allowed to do homework or chores without written permission. He took photos of the permission binder and the flooded kitchen, then gave me his card and said someone from family services might be calling. The next morning, the school called to check on me after their earlier concerns about Greg's parenting. They wanted to set up a meeting with the counselor, and when Mom answered from the hospital, she agreed we both needed to talk to someone about everything that had happened. They scheduled us for later that week with the counselor, a guy named Ravi, who'd already been documenting Greg's weird rules from the earlier parent conference. While Mom was still at the hospital, Greg sent a group text to his whole family trying to explain his side of everything. He blamed my disrespect for his injury, said I'd manipulated the situation to hurt him, that I was out of control and dangerous. Most of his relatives didn't respond at all, and the few who did sent really careful messages about hoping he recovered soon without actually taking sides. His sister called Mom privately, though, not through the group text, and Mom talked to her for almost an hour about everything that had been happening. 2 days later, Greg got a call from work that made him throw his phone across the hospital bed. Mom told me later that HR had scheduled a meeting with him about the anonymous tip they'd gotten about his home situation, and Jillian Stratton from Human Resources wanted to discuss how his personal life was affecting his work performance. Mom warned me while we cleaned up the water damage that Greg's job stress would make things worse when he got home, and we should prepare for more anger than before. The kitchen floor had warped from all the water, and we kept finding puddles in weird places like under the refrigerator and behind the trash can. While we were moving furniture to dry the baseboards, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voicemail was from someone named Heidi Ward, who said she was a caseworker with Child Protective Services and needed to schedule a home visit to make sure I was safe after the school's documentation had triggered an intake call. My hands started shaking when I played the message for Mom, and she sat down hard on the wet floor like her legs had given out. She kept saying we needed to get away from Greg while he recovered in the hospital, maybe stay with her cousin or find a cheap motel, but when she checked our bank account on her phone, her face went white. The medical bills from the ambulance and emergency room had already started hitting, and our checking account had less than $200 left. She called 3 different hotels, but even the cheapest one wanted $80 a night plus deposit, and her cousin lived 4 hours away, which would mean I'd miss school. The next morning, Heidi Ward called back while I was eating cereal, and Mom put her on speaker so we could both hear. She explained that the investigation wasn't about punishment, but about making sure I had a safe environment, and she walked us through our rights, including the right to have someone present during interviews and the right to see any reports filed about us. Her voice was calm and professional, but also kind, like she actually cared about helping instead of just checking boxes on a form. She scheduled the home visit for next week and told us to just be honest about everything that had happened. At the school that afternoon, the counselor Ravi Gao pulled me out of math class for a one-on-one meeting about my missing assignments. We sat in his small office that smelled like coffee and printer paper while he pulled up my grades on his computer and showed me how far behind I'd gotten. He helped me make a plan to catch up, mapping out which assignments were most important and which teachers might give extensions, and we created a schedule that assumed I'd have a stable place to do homework soon, even though that felt impossible. He printed out the plan and highlighted the deadlines in yellow, telling me to take it one assignment at a time instead of getting overwhelmed by the whole list. On my way home, I saw our neighbor Rosa Lyons trimming her roses, and she waved me over to her fence. She looked around to make sure nobody was watching, then handed me a small flash drive, whispering that she'd recorded video of the flooding and my explanation to the EMTS about not being allowed to touch the washing machine. She said she'd been worried about me for months after seeing me standing in the yard, unable to go inside without permission, and she wanted to help however she could. The flash drive felt heavy in my pocket as I thanked her and went inside. Mom was sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by bills and insurance paperwork, and she looked up with red eyes like she'd been crying. She suggested that while Greg was still in the hospital, I should move into the guest room since it had a lock on the door, and for the first time in months, I might be able to sleep without worrying about what I was allowed to touch. We spent the evening moving my stuff into the smaller room, and I tested the lock 3 times to make sure it actually worked. Greg came home the next morning on crutches, his ankle in a cast, and his hip wrapped in bandages. He immediately called a family meeting in the living room and announced he was canceling the permission rule since it had caused too much trouble. But then he started listing new rules about showing proper respect and appropriate behavior and consideration for others, except none of these had clear boundaries like the permission rule did. I couldn't tell what would count as disrespect or what appropriate meant, and somehow these vague demands felt worse because I had no way to follow them perfectly. He kept talking about respect, while Mom stared at the wall, and I wondered how I was supposed to know what he wanted when he couldn't even explain it clearly. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived from the insurance company with a letter suggesting they might deny our claim for the water damage. The adjuster wrote that leaving a washing machine running for 2 days showed negligence, and they needed more information before approving any payments. Mom spread out the repair estimates on the table, and they added up to almost $8,000 for the ruined floors, damaged baseboards, and warped cabinets. She called the insurance company, but they just kept saying they were investigating and couldn't promise anything. A week later, Heidi arrived for the home visit right on time, carrying a tablet and a folder of paperwork. She noticed the permission binder still sitting on the kitchen counter where Greg had left it, and she picked it up and started flipping through the pages of written permissions. Greg limped in on his crutches and tried to explain it was just a simple discipline technique to teach boundaries, but Heidi was already taking photos of each page with her tablet. She asked Greg to explain the reasoning behind requiring written permission for basic necessities like using the bathroom or eating food, and he kept insisting it was about respect and responsibility, while she typed notes about coercive control patterns. She interviewed me separately in my new room with the lock, asking specific questions about how long the rules had been in place and how they affected my daily life. I showed her the flash drive from Rosa, and she copied the files onto her tablet, her face getting more serious as she watched the video of me explaining to the EMTS why I couldn't turn off the washing machine. Heidi pulled out a thick packet of papers from her folder and started writing a safety plan right there at our kitchen table, her pen moving fast across the pages while Greg watched from his spot on the couch with his injured leg propped up. She wrote down specific rules about no unilateral restrictions, meaning Greg couldn't just make up new rules without everyone agreeing, and she added weekly check-ins where she'd come by to make sure things were getting better. Mom signed the papers right away without even reading all the small print, her hand shaking a little as she wrote her name, but Greg just sat there with his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles in his face twitching. Heidi explained that this wasn't optional, and if Greg didn't follow the plan, she'd have to take more serious steps, which made him finally grab the pen and scrawl his signature so hard it tore through the paper a little. That night after Heidi left, I was brushing my teeth when I heard Greg's voice coming from their bedroom, that low, dangerous tone he used when he was really mad, but trying not to yell. He was telling Mom that I'd manipulated everyone, turned the whole world against him, made him look crazy when all he wanted was some basic respect in his own house. Mom's voice was too quiet to hear clearly, but I could tell she was trying to calm him down, and then his voice got louder saying she was taking my side like always, and couldn't she see what I was doing to their marriage? I went back to my room and started taking pictures of everything with my phone, all his old permission notes, the spots where water damage was showing on the walls, timestamps of when things happened so I'd have proof if this got worse. The next morning, Mom told me that Jillian from HR had called Greg in for a formal interview about his home situation and how it was affecting his work, and after the call, he'd been pacing around the living room muttering to himself about lawsuits and wrongful termination. 2 days later, Ravi called me into his office at the school, and we spent an hour going through all my missed assignments, creating a plan with specific deadlines and extensions that would let me catch up without failing the semester. He printed out a calendar with different colored boxes for each subject and showed me how to break big projects into smaller pieces, saying it wasn't a free pass, but a real chance to fix my grades if I worked hard. I was actually starting to feel better about school when Greg completely lost it 3 nights later, standing outside my locked bedroom door screaming about respect and gratitude and how I was an ungrateful brat for 20 straight minutes. My hands were shaking as I held my phone up to record his voice getting louder and louder, yelling that I'd destroyed his life and turned his own wife against him, and he wished I'd never been born. The recording caught him kicking the door so hard it rattled in the frame, and then Mom's voice trying to pull him away while he kept screaming that this was his house, and he'd say whatever he wanted. About 10 minutes into his rant, we heard knocking at the front door and Rosa's voice asking if everything was okay, which made Greg go silent immediately. I unlocked my door and went to answer it, and Rosa looked right at me and said quietly that she'd been keeping a log of dates and times when she heard yelling, and if I ever needed someone to verify what was happening, she had it all written down. Greg limped back to the living room acting like nothing had happened, but Rosa stayed in the doorway for another minute, making sure I was really okay before she left. That night, Mom came into my room with her pillow and a blanket, setting up a makeshift bed on the floor because she didn't want to sleep in the same room as Greg anymore. We started texting each other instead of talking out loud because any conversation might set him off, and the house felt like walking through a field full of landmines where one wrong step would cause an explosion. Mom's phone would buzz with messages from Greg demanding she come back to their room, but she'd just turn it to silent and squeeze my hand in the dark. 4 days later, Heidi showed up without calling first, and I immediately handed her my phone with the audio recording of Greg's screaming session. Greg must have seen her car pull up, because he switched into polite mode instantly, limping out to greet her with this fake concerned voice, asking if everything was okay and apologizing for missing their scheduled check-in. I watched his face while Heidi listened to the recording on my phone, saw the rage building behind his fake smile as his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She took notes about him violating the safety plan and said she'd need to file an updated report, and Greg kept nodding and agreeing while his eyes looked like he wanted to throw something. The next morning, Greg started another fight about the dishes that had been sitting in the sink for 3 days, because I still wasn't sure if I was allowed to wash them under the new safety plan rules. He was yelling that I was doing this on purpose to make him look bad, and Mom finally snapped and told him we were leaving for a few days to let things cool down. We threw clothes into bags while Greg followed us around the house saying we were overreacting and being dramatic. But Mom kept packing and grabbed her purse with the credit cards. The motel we found was 20 minutes away and smelled like old carpet and cigarette smoke, with a broken air conditioner and stains on the ceiling, but at least we could touch things without asking permission. Mom spread out the receipts on the bed and used her phone calculator to add up how much 2 nights would cost. And I saw her face go pale when she realized the credit card was almost maxed out from medical bills and the insurance deductible. She pulled out more papers from her bag, and I watched her write numbers on the back of an old envelope, each one making her hand shake a little more. The hospital bill was $4,000 after insurance. The water damage estimate was $12,000, and she'd missed 5 days of work, which meant $800 gone from her next paycheck. She kept adding and re-adding like the total might change if she did it enough times, but it always came out to more than we had or could get. Her phone buzzed with an email from Greg, and she opened it while I read over her shoulder. He was threatening to file for parental alienation if we didn't come home within 24 hours, using legal terms he'd probably Googled and saying the court would force us back anyway. Mom forwarded it to Heidi without typing anything, just hitting send and putting the phone face down on the bed like it might bite her. The next morning, her phone rang early, and it was Jillian from Greg's company asking if Mom could provide a timeline of events for their investigation. Mom sat at the tiny motel desk, writing dates and facts on hotel stationery, while I sat next to her, nodding when she got the details right, but not saying anything because Jillian had asked for Mom's perspective only. She wrote about the permission notebook, the washing machine running for 2 days, the water damage, everything in short sentences with no opinions attached. At the school that Monday, everyone was whispering and looking at me because someone's parent had seen the ambulance at our house and told other parents who told their kids. One girl asked if my stepdad was really in the hospital, and another wanted to know if it was true about the permission slips for everything. I walked past them to my locker and grabbed my books, focusing on the makeup assignments Ravi had helped me organize instead of the gossip spreading through the hallway. During lunch, Heidi called Mom to say she was petitioning the court for a temporary protective order that would set clear boundaries for parenting. She explained it wasn't about punishing Greg, but creating structure so everyone knew the rules and nobody could claim confusion or misunderstanding later. Mom put it on speaker so I could hear Heidi say the judge would probably grant it, given the documentation they already had. 2 days later, we went back to the house while Greg was at physical therapy to get more clothes, and I found an expensive drone on my bed with a note in Greg's handwriting. The note said we could start fresh and forget everything if I told CPS this was all a big misunderstanding, that I'd exaggerated and nobody meant any harm. The drone was still in its box with the receipt showing he'd paid $300 for it, trying to buy my cooperation like I was 5 years old. I left it there and went to Greg's room where I placed a printed copy of the safety plan requirements on his pillow, all the rules Heidi had established about appropriate discipline and boundaries. No note from me, no explanation, just the official document centered perfectly on his pillow where he couldn't miss it. Mom made an appointment with a divorce attorney the next day, and we sat in an office that smelled like leather and coffee while the lawyer explained filing fees and retainer costs. The retainer alone was $5,000, and Mom's face went white when she heard it, because that was more than we'd have even if we emptied both savings accounts. The lawyer gave us pamphlets about legal aid and low-cost options, but we both knew those had waiting lists months long and might not even take cases like ours. Walking back to the car, Mom held the pamphlets tight enough to wrinkle them, and I could see her calculating if she could work extra shifts or sell things to get the money. 3 days after that, we got a letter saying the court had scheduled a hearing for the protective order in 1 week. Heidi called to explain what would happen, how the judge would ask questions, and I might need to testify about the household rules and how they affected me. She said to just tell the truth and keep answers short, don't volunteer extra information, and don't get emotional even if Greg's lawyer tried to upset me. Mom practiced with me that night, pretending to be the judge and asking me questions while I answered calmly, even though my stomach was churning. Saturday afternoon, Greg's sister showed up without calling first, knocking on the door while we were eating sandwiches in the kitchen. She said she wanted to help mediate and find a solution that worked for everyone, speaking softer to Mom than she ever had before. She asked Mom to give her 5 minutes with Greg alone, and Mom agreed, probably hoping his sister could talk sense into him. They went into Greg's study and closed the door, while Mom and I waited in the kitchen, listening to muffled voices getting louder, then quieter, then louder again. 20 minutes later, his sister came out looking frustrated and said Greg was convinced we were trying to destroy his life on purpose. She apologized to Mom for not seeing the problem sooner and left without saying goodbye to Greg, who stayed in his study with the door locked. Mom started crying after his sister left, not loud sobs, but quiet tears that she wiped away with a dish towel while standing at the sink. 2 days later, Greg cornered me in the hallway while Mom was at work, standing so close I could smell the coffee on his breath. He kept saying CPS was making a big deal out of nothing, and I needed to tell them everything was fine, his hand on the wall blocking my path to my room. I took a step back and reminded him the safety plan said we had to maintain appropriate boundaries, watching his face turn red as he realized I was using his own rules against him again. He moved aside, but kept talking about how this was destroying his career and his life, following me down the hall until I locked my bedroom door. The next morning at the school, I had a full panic attack thinking about testifying in court, my chest getting tight and my hands shaking so bad I couldn't hold a pencil. Ravi found me in the bathroom trying to breathe and taught me this technique where you count 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, and 1 you can taste. We sat on the floor practicing breathing exercises for 20 minutes, him counting with me until my hands stopped shaking and I could think straight again. He gave me this card with positive phrases to repeat when I felt scared. Things like, I am safe right now, and this feeling will pass, that actually helped more than I expected. 3 days before court, Heidi came over to practice testimony with me, setting up chairs in the living room like a courtroom. She explained I should only answer exactly what they ask, never guess or add extra information, and always tell the truth, even if it makes me look bad. We went through every possible question about the permission notes and the washing machine and the trash incident, practicing until I could answer without my voice cracking or getting angry. The morning of the hearing, my stomach hurt so bad, I threw up twice before we left for court. Outside the courthouse, I watched Greg limp in with his lawyer, this older guy in a suit that probably cost more than our car, while Mom held my hand so tight, my fingers went numb. Greg went first, and I had to sit outside while he testified. But Mom told me later he called the whole permission thing a teaching moment that got misunderstood and made it sound like I was just being dramatic. His lawyer apparently showed pictures of the house before the water damage and talked about how Greg was trying to instill discipline in a difficult teenager. When my turn came, my legs felt like jelly walking to the witness stand, but I remembered Ravi's breathing technique and counted 5 wood panels on the wall. The prosecutor asked about the trash, and I explained how I couldn't touch the bags without written permission, and the garbage truck came while Greg was still listing what I could touch. I showed the photos Rosa gave me of the permission notes, including one that said, "Can touch doorknobs between 3 p.m. and 9 p.m. only," and explained how I had to plan my whole day around when I could open doors. My voice shook when I described the washing machine running for 2 days because I couldn't touch it to turn it off, but I got through every question without crying or yelling. The judge asked me directly if I felt safe at home, and I said not, when Greg made rules that stopped me from doing homework or eating properly. After 3 hours of testimony, the judge granted a temporary protective order requiring Greg to attend parenting classes and establishing structured separation periods where he couldn't be alone with me. It wasn't the full restraining order Mom hoped for, but it meant legal protection we didn't have before, something official saying his behavior wasn't okay. Meanwhile, Greg's company put him on a performance improvement plan after everything came out, requiring him to attend counseling sessions to keep his job. The office gossip had mostly died down according to Mom's friend who worked there, but everyone knew something had happened and treated Greg differently, like he might snap at any moment. 2 weeks after court, Mom found a tiny apartment we could afford with her salary alone. Just 1 bedroom we'd share with a pull-out couch in the living room. The place was smaller than Greg's garage, and the neighbors upstairs walked around in boots at midnight, but we could touch everything without asking permission. We moved our stuff in 3 trips with Mom's car, mostly clothes and some dishes her sister gave us, leaving behind all the furniture Greg had measured and positioned so carefully. That first night in the apartment, we ate Chinese takeout sitting on the floor, using plastic forks, without having to request permission, and Mom actually smiled for the first time in weeks. The next morning, a CPS worker showed up for our first monitoring visit, checking that we had food and running water and a safe place to sleep. She explained they'd be checking in regularly for the next 60 days, and we had to follow every requirement exactly, no exceptions or excuses. Mom and I both knew this meant playing by their rules perfectly, showing up for every appointment and meeting even when it meant missing work or school. The monitoring felt invasive, but it also meant someone was watching, someone who could step in if Greg tried anything, and after everything that happened, we needed that backup more than our pride. The next few weeks at the school became a blur of makeup work and extra credit assignments. Ravi had worked out a deal with my teachers where I could turn in late work for partial credit, and I spent every lunch period in the library catching up on months of missed assignments. My English teacher let me write essays about what happened with Greg instead of the assigned books I hadn't read, and my math teacher stayed after school twice a week to help me understand the units I'd missed. The grades started climbing back up slowly, most of them reaching C's and B's by the end of the marking period, though chemistry stayed at a D because I'd missed too many labs to make up. Ravi checked in with me every Friday to go over my progress chart, marking off completed assignments with a green highlighter and circling the ones still due. One afternoon, while we were unpacking the last of our boxes in the apartment, Mom stopped folding clothes and sat down on the floor next to me. She said she knew she should have gotten us out of there months ago when Greg first started with his crazy rules, and she was sorry for letting it get so bad. I told her I knew I'd made things worse by pushing back the way I did, using his own rules to destroy everything, and maybe if I'd just talked to someone instead of trying to get revenge, we could have avoided some of this mess. We didn't cry or hug or have some big moment, just sat there on the floor surrounded by cardboard boxes and admitted we'd both made mistakes. Mom went back to folding and I kept sorting through old school papers, but something felt lighter between us. 3 days later, Mom's phone buzzed with a text from Greg that just said he needed to pick up his golf clubs and some files from the garage, asking what time would work with the court schedule. No threats, no guilt trips, no mentions of how we'd ruined his life, just a simple request with dates and times. Mom forwarded it to Heidi and our lawyer, then responded with 2 possible windows when we wouldn't be home. The whole exchange took 5 minutes and felt weird in how normal it was, like Greg had finally figured out that acting reasonable got him further than his usual tactics. That weekend, Rosa knocked on our door carrying a small wooden desk and a reading lamp she said her church had collected for families starting over. The desk was scratched and one drawer stuck, but it fit perfectly in the corner of the bedroom where I'd been doing homework on the floor. Rosa helped us carry it up the stairs, then stayed for coffee, while Mom thanked her for everything she'd done, from keeping notes to offering the video evidence. Rosa waved it off, saying neighbors look out for each other, but I could see Mom getting emotional about having someone on our side. The school set me up with a therapist who came once a week during study hall, a quiet woman who taught me to write down 3 things I could control each day and 3 things I couldn't. At first, I thought it was stupid, but after a few sessions, I found myself automatically sorting problems into those categories, which made everything feel less overwhelming. She had me write about specific moments with Greg, not to share with anyone, but just to get them out of my head and onto paper where they couldn't spin around keeping me awake. The journal filled up faster than I expected. Pages and pages of anger and confusion and fear that looked smaller once they were just words on paper. About a month into apartment living, I was getting ready for bed when I noticed I'd turned off all the lights and closed the fridge without thinking about it. No mental checklist of permissions, no hesitation about touching things, just normal actions that normal people do without thinking. I stood there in the dark kitchen for a minute, opening and closing the fridge door just because I could, flipping the light switch on and off, touching the counters and cabinets without asking anyone. Mom found me there doing this weird celebration and didn't say anything, just smiled and went back to her room. Later that week, I took a picture of my completed assignment planner, every box checked off for the first time all semester, and sent it to Ravi. He sent back a thumbs-up emoji, no long message about being proud or how far I'd come, just that simple acknowledgement that I'd done what I needed to do. I saved the screenshot anyway, proof that I could finish something even after everything fell apart. That night, I lay in bed listening to the hum of our cheap fridge and the neighbors walking around upstairs, thinking about how different everything was from 6 months ago. Nothing was completely fixed, because Mom still cried sometimes when she thought I was asleep and my grades would never fully recover, and we were living in an apartment smaller than Greg's garage. But this space was ours, every inch of it touchable without permission, and we'd made it through the worst part still standing, still together, still fighting. That felt like enough for now. Kinda wild how time just flew by there, 2 years gone in only a few sentences. Stuff like that always gets me. I'll catch you in the next one. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.